Today we are going to be watching a video called All Atheist Arguments Answered in 10 Minutes. I'm going to try to answer these answers as quickly as possible, but I can be kind of long-winded, so we'll see how that goes. But without further ado, let's get into it.
Atheists have a lot of arguments, but they never really think of anything new that the church hasn't had answers to for the past 2,000 years. So let's answer them.
Actually, the fact is, your answers are just not good enough for us. That's the only problem here.
Religion causes wars. Well, actually, only 7% of all human wars were caused by religion.
I question that number because how can you know all the wars in history? You just know the recent ones. A lot more of those are going to be secular.
And if you remove Islamic wars, that number drops down to 3%. A lot of evil has been done in the name of religion. This is true, but the most murderous people in human history have been atheists.
Total non sequitur, has nothing to do with the question at all.
This doesn't mean religion is true, it just means you can't use that as an argument against it.
Yes, you can, because on the whole, religion does a lot worse. The fact that atheists may do bad things doesn't mean that atheism causes bad things.
If you were born somewhere else, you wouldn't be a Christian. Okay, and if you were born somewhere else, you wouldn't be an atheist. Everyone's beliefs are shaped by their context.
Yes, that is certainly true. I think we can agree on this point.
How do you know which religion is true? Well, everyone, religious or not, has faith in a certain worldview. It's just that some worldviews are called religions and some are secular.
I don't think you can actually say that for a fact. I don't think I have faith in nihilism. I think I'm just a natural nihilist. I was just kind of born that way.
But everyone has to ask the question of which worldview best explains the world. There's no
But you didn't answer the question, so whatever.
scientific proof that God exists. Well, by definition, science can only prove things inside the natural world, and by definition, God is something outside the natural world.
Yes, to speak of unnatural things, things that aren't in the natural world, is to speak of nothings, things that don't exist. If you have no proof for a concept, there is no reason to believe in that concept.
So science can neither prove nor disprove God. There's no evidence of anything supernatural. Well, that's just not accurate. There are medically documented cases of people with demonic possession speaking
There are medically documented cases of people with schizophrenia acting like people with schizophrenia.
in languages they don't know, for example.
Not correct. It's like there's cases of people getting traumatic head injuries and they're talking gibberish, but people assume that it's Chinese or something, even though they don't know Chinese. It's something like that, I'm sure.
And people with near-death experiences getting information they never had access to.
And we have never shown that any such information is important or valid in any sense, or anything special.
The Bible has contradictions. Okay, you think you found an apparent contradiction that the church hasn't known about for 2,000 years?
Whether the church knows about it or not is inconsequential to the fact that they exist in the first place.
Every apparent contradiction can be explained by understanding just a little bit of theology.
No, they can't really, because when you talk about contradictions, you're talking about some major ones, like the birth story of Jesus has some serious contradictions, and that's just one example you can find in the Gospels, but there are plenty more.
The Gospels were anonymous. Okay, anonymous doesn't mean we have no idea who wrote them.
Yes, it kind of does. We don't know who wrote the Gospels. We have no idea. We just attribute them to their current authors because of tradition.
It just means the names of the authors aren't signed in the text itself. But we literally have writings from church fathers who knew the apostles and can verify that they indeed wrote the books named after them.
No, that's not correct. Sorry.
The Gospels misquote Jesus. Now, it's true that a lot of secular scholars think the Gospels are a mix of real quotes from the historical Jesus and fake quotes added by the church, but none of them can agree on which quotes are legit and which are not, so we can
The mere existence of fake quotes is bad news for your argument that the Bible is in any way an authority on anything in particular.
discard their opinions. Jesus never
You can't just discard their opinions because they disagree. They disagree on whether certain things were actually from Jesus or not. What they agree on is some things were definitely not from Jesus. There's considerable overlap. YouTube operates on watch time, so if you like this video and videos like it and want to help it get further, please watch just a minute or two more than you were planning to. It will help a whole lot with the algorithms. Like and subscribe because that also helps. And thank you very much. Let's get back to the video.
claimed to be God. Yes, he did. He didn't say, I am God, worship me, but he showed that he was God in many places in all four Gospels by doing things that only God can do.
I think this is an incredible non-argument because if the claim is Jesus never claimed to be God, that's a correct claim. He did not claim to be God, in fact.
It's true that he didn't walk around before his resurrection claiming to be God, because he wanted people to figure it out themselves. That's why he kept saying, who do you say that I am?
No, it's because he knew he would be killed for blasphemy if he actually said, I am God.
However, after his resurrection, people figured out that he was God, and Jesus congratulated them.
There is no evidence for Jesus' resurrection. I think we should just say that really quickly.
The later one of the Gospels was written, the more divine it makes Jesus seem, so we can extrapolate that Jesus was originally a human figure who got made more divine over time.
Yes, that is correct.
Alright, maybe some Gospels emphasize Jesus' divinity more than others, but what about Paul's letters that fully confess the divinity of Jesus and were also written before any of the Gospels? So
Paul didn't actually know a whole lot about Christianity. He had just heard a bunch of things about Christianity from Christians. That's where his perspectives came from. The writers of Mark, Luke, John, and so on are very different.
that breaks your pattern. The Bible supports slavery. No, it doesn't. Just because there's slavery in the Bible doesn't mean the Bible supports it.
I mean, the Bible literally lays out how it's best to treat your slaves. If the Bible wanted to be against slavery, it could say slavery is wrong, but that was not stated. What was stated is, here is the correct way to treat your slaves. That's pretty much an endorsement of slavery, if you ask me.
There are some Old Testament verses that could be interpreted as condoning slavery, but Jesus himself said that the Old Testament made accommodations to people's sinful state. And also, slave owners in the American South had slave Bibles for their slaves to read, but it omitted a lot of the real Bible, so if the Bible actually did support slavery, this wouldn't have been necessary.
Okay, so this has nothing to do with anything this guy is saying. Slavery in America is very different than slavery in the Bible, which we know happened. And, in fact, not only did it happen, it was directly called for in some instances, i.e. after the genocide of the Canaanites, if I am not mistaken.
Christianity supported slavery. Well, sure, some Christians
Well, correct, it did, in fact.
did, but all human civilizations have had slavery. Christian civilization was the first one to abolish it on moral grounds.
I think it's very important to note here that if Christian ethics were so advanced, Christians would not have continued slavery after taking over the Roman Empire in the 400s, and would not have had slavery from that point clear until the 1800s. The fact that slavery continued for so long sort of proves that Christian ethics alone weren't enough to undo slavery. It was sort of modernized ethics that ultimately undid slavery.
The fact that you're against slavery is due to Christian influence. Also,
No, it's not. It's just, like, not at all. I don't see any rationale for slavery from any perspective, from any point of view. And there have been atheists all throughout history who have called out the institution of slavery as being uniquely immoral and evil, well before Christians ever did.
most organizations fighting modern-day slavery are Christian. God killed
Well, that may be true, but that's pretty irrelevant. I think that there are a lot fewer secular organizations able to fight that kind of thing. I mean, secular in the sense of being explicitly atheist. Certainly, all the governmental programs against slavery today are secular in orientation. They may be led by Christians, fueled by Christianity, all that good stuff, but in the end, they are still secular organizations fighting human slavery, and they do more than religion does against slavery.
tons of people in the Bible. Well, it's actually way more than that. God numbers everyone's days. He's the giver of life, so he can take it, especially if people sin.
So this is something like when your parents say, oh, I gave you life, I can take it. We don't buy that as a good argument, and I don't think we should buy this argument as a good one either.
Atheist countries are more prosperous.
Correct.
Yes, it's true that Northern European countries are very prosperous and very secular, but correlation doesn't equal causation.
It sort of does, though. If a Christian is saying that God blesses people who follow him, as Christians frequently do, then Mississippi and Alabama should be the wealthiest, most happy places on earth, and yet they are not. Likewise with Islam and places like Saudi Arabia that are almost uniquely unhappy by world standards. It turns out the most secular places are the most happy and the most wealthy in general. There are some exceptions, for example, in certain Middle Eastern countries that have high incomes and maybe are a little bit happier than other countries in that area. But on the whole, atheist countries are more prosperous and happier.
It's not like atheism causes prosperity, it's that prosperity causes atheism because when people have comfortable lives, they don't feel a need to depend on God.
I don't know if that's true at all, and I don't think many people who argue about secularization theory would say that's true. The only country there with a higher GDP per capita than America is Norway, and yet America is by far the most religious of all four of those countries, so you cannot just say prosperity naturally leads to atheism.
But why are these particular countries so prosperous in the first place? They may be secular now, but they're rooted in generations and generations of Protestant Christianity. If you want
And yet, Africa is not a bastion of progress when it comes to economies and economics, despite the fact that it is heavily Christian and has been heavily Christian for a very long time. Now, the economies there are improving, but to say they're improving is not to say much, because if you're at the bottom, the only place to go is up, so...
Want an example of a country that's atheist and not rooted in Christianity? Look at communist China.
Yes, look at communist China, which has had incredibly, insanely high growth rates for like the past 40 years and which has pulled 800 million people out of poverty in the past 20 years alone and has become the top country in the world by GDP by purchasing power and should soon become the top country in the world in GDP per capita as well. Communist China is not your example of a country forsaken by God. They're an example of a country that has grown phenomenally and continues to do so despite having significant problems.
There's 4,000 gods that people believe in, and you're atheist to 3,999 of them. I just go one god further. Okay, this isn't the gotcha that you think it is, because the question of whether some sort of god exists is fundamentally different from the question of which religion is right about God.
I actually sort of agree there because I do not think that is really a good argument. The non-existence of all those other gods doesn't itself prove the non-existence of the last one. It may just be the case that the last one is real. However, I don't think that's very likely for obvious reasons.
If God created everything, then who created God? Well, God is defined as the uncaused causer.
Yes, we have heard this argument a million times, and it remains every bit as unconvincing now as it always has. This argument we do not buy. It's not that we've never heard it before, we just don't buy it. If you want to say that the universe can't have existed forever or whatever because it's too complicated, too complex to just have existed, then you have to say the same thing about God, which is infinitely more complex than that. Something had to create God also in that case, if you ask me.
Everyone knows there needs to be a first cause at the beginning of the chain of all events in the universe, and it makes a lot more sense for that first cause to be a personal God who caused things for a reason.
No, it doesn't. You have yet to point to that in any reasonable way. You could point to a god, but to say it has to be a personal god, I think is a much bigger leap than just saying it had to be a god. Sure, if you say it had to be a god of some kind, I think that's still extremely unlikely, but it seems less unlikely than to say it has to be a personal god. You have yet to fill some of those gaps.
Rather than some random impersonal force. Science disproves God. Well, actually, the church invented modern science.
That is a total non sequitur. Yet again, it doesn't matter who invented what. The church did not, in fact, invent the concept of evolution. The church, in fact, itself did not invent the idea of the Big Bang. And the point we're getting at here when we say science disproves God, and I wouldn't say that, by the way, I would say that science makes God a much less likely because it takes away the need for there to be a God. If mankind has evolved over long periods of time from ape-like ancestors, and if that evolutionary chain goes back a billion years, that undoes the need for, let's say, a lot of the Genesis story. If the Big Bang happened, then that also undoes the need for a Genesis sort of story of like, let there be light and such. Now, you can say that those things happened anyway, and they jive perfectly with Christianity or, whatever. But at the same time, the fact that we have naturalistic explanations for these things that were once only explained by religion is, I think, a very big problem for religion.
All the founders of the scientific revolution deeply believed in God, and medieval theologians laid the groundwork for modern science by
Literally irrelevant. Does not matter one bit.
seeing the world was governed by an intelligent creator. That means we can understand the world with our intelligence. And studying God led to studying the world because the world is God's creation. God is just used to fill in the gaps of things that science can't explain yet.
Correct. That's how that works.
Well, actually, God is the reason for everything, even things that science can explain. It's not
Prove that. Let's see it.
one or the other. It's not like everything's explained by either science or God, and the more science can explain, the less God can explain. Really, science can explain almost everything, but God is still behind it all, because science explains the how, and God explains the why.
Meaningless distinction. Why does there have to be a why? Why can't there just be a how? If anything, it seems like there is only a how. The universe doesn't seem to care a whole lot about us at all. You say God is the reason for everything, even if science can't explain it, but we're talking about the Christian God specifically here. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, and it has a specific order that we now know is wrong. How do we know that? Science. God created mankind, Adam and Eve, and we know that's not true. That's not correct. So God actually goes against science in this particular case as it relates to Christianity, unless you take those stories as metaphor. And if you take those beginning stories as metaphor, I don't see the reason to take any of the others as literal.
If God is good, why can't he destroy all evil? Well, he eventually will. Why can't he do
Well, I mean, no, he won't, because hell will exist for eternity, according to Christians, and hell seems like a pretty evil place, doesn't it? That is not the destruction of evil if you leave that terrible evil itself behind.
it now? Because he'd have to destroy you. Why
Well, that's a loving God right there.
does God let any bad things happen? Because we deserve it.
Prove that. Why do we deserve it? I don't buy that. You got to prove that to me. You can't just say, well, we deserve it. No, that's not a good argument. If God is good, if God good, why bad things happen is actually a really good argument. The problem of evil, you can't just dismiss by saying, well, we deserve it. We have it coming. I don't believe we do.
Well, animals don't sin, so why do they suffer? Well, the Bible says all things will be restored, so if God is good, we can assume that they will be compensated.
I don't think that's what that was referring to, but okay. Nice stretch there, my guy.
How do you know that God isn't evil instead?
I would say that somebody who floods a whole world and drowns every baby and also commands genocides is pretty bad, personally.
Well, because evil is not a thing the way good is. Just like cold is just a lack of heat, and dark is just a lack of light, evil is just a lack of good. And
That is a fantastic way of avoiding the question.
for good to be objective, it needs to come from God. So a God who is objectively evil is logically impossible.
No, it isn't. It isn't logically impossible at all, and the whole concept of a good God is impossible when we're talking about somebody who is literally genocidal like Hitler. Worse than Hitler, actually.
Can God make a rock he can't lift? Well, you're just asking if God can contradict himself, like can God lie, or can God change, or can God make another God? And the answer to all those things is no.
Well, if God can't do everything, he's not God then, is he? Can't God do everything? Isn't he supposed to be able to do everything? I mean, this seems like a pretty big problem for you theologically.
God being all-powerful means he can do anything to things outside himself. It doesn't mean that he can do anything to himself, or that he can contradict himself.
Well, that just doesn't make any sense. I don't know why you would say that. It doesn't make any sense. It literally does not. This is a nonsense argument.
Why did God let evil exist at all? So he could be glorified in defeating it.
How does he defeat it? By losing the battle? I mean, if he's in a battle for souls with Satan, it seems like he's coming out on the losing side here. Granted, if there is a war in heaven, he might win that, but that's irrelevant to the fact that he lost the battle for souls in the end, because more people, according to Christianity, are going to hell than not. Something like 100 billion humans have lived throughout humanity's existence. Currently, there are about 10 billion alive. A vast majority of those will be going to the Christian hell. So, no, he's not really defeating it at all.
Triumph over evil is a greater good than evil having just never existed.
Why did God create evil in the first place? It seems like he must have done that. Like, I don't think it would have existed on its own, would it? Why would you create something you hate? That doesn't seem like a very good thing. If I hated evil, I wouldn't create it in the first place.
Religion is just wishful thinking.
Correct.
Well, if that were true, then the Bible wouldn't be all about how much we all suck.
The Bible isn't just about how much we all suck. The Bible is also about how you will be rewarded if you acknowledge how much you suck and bow down before your omnipotent, very angry, and jealous creator.
Psychology explains why you believe in God.
Correct.
So what? If God is real, we should expect there to be some psychological or social benefit to believing in him.
And yet, more religious countries are not necessarily happier, so that's a big problem for you. Again, going back to the example of the countries that are more prosperous despite not having God. Switzerland, Sweden, Norway, countries like that, all happier than places like, Alabama and Mississippi, where people are a lot more religious, but also a lot more unhappy. That's a big problem for your side.
Spiritual experiences can be explained by brain chemicals.
Correct. Ever done mushrooms? I have. That is quite the spiritual experience. I took, earlier last year, I took a see God level of mushrooms, and if I were a less logical person, I probably would have seen God, but I'm not, so I didn't. And I can just explain that through brain chemicals. What was happening there? Well, I took a drug and it affected my brain chemistry, and I started seeing stuff and feeling stuff that really wasn't there. That's how brain chemicals work. The brain is essentially just a small amount of fat, like a few pounds of fat, 8 pounds or something like that, with electrical impulses flooding through it at all times, making you experience just a sort of hallucination of reality. What you see, not the real world. Fun fact.
Well, romantic experiences can also be explained by brain chemicals, but that doesn't mean your wife isn't real. So spiritual experiences being explained by brain chemicals doesn't mean that God isn't real.
That comparison makes no sense. You know your wife is real because you can see her. Now, when it comes to romantic experiences, romance is also a series of brain chemicals. The romance you have doesn't really exist outside of your mind. You can act on it physically, but it doesn't exist outside of your mind. It is not a physical thing you can actually touch. It is not something you can work with. You can have these experiences, but the meaning of the experience is what we question. So there's that.
Well, drug trips show that spiritual experiences are from the brain.
Correct, as I just stated. I've had some pretty good ones over time, and obviously other people who have had these experiences who are like more prone to magical thinking have had really religious experiences through things like shrooms and LSD. Doesn't make it real.
Well, people who have had both drug trips and near death experiences say that they're completely different categories of feeling.
Just because they say that doesn't make it true. And just for the record, I have known people who have had both, and they say both are very similar. My cousin almost died. He tried to unalive himself many years ago. I actually was the one who stopped him from dying that day. And he was in a coma for 2 weeks. He had a near death experience because at one point his heart stopped. And he's also done a lot of psychedelics over the years. He says that what he experienced in his near-death experience was very similar to what he's experienced in psychedelics, and that's part of the reason why he does psychedelics. It turns out that near-death experiences, even for atheists like my cousin, are not necessarily a bad thing.
The story of Jesus was copied from the story of Horus or some other ancient character. Okay, dude, that's a Reddit atheist level myth. Even atheist scholars know that that's silly.
Yeah, I don't think that's actually a good example. This is another point where I'll agree with this guy. Basically, there are comparisons to be made between Jesus and other figures that have mythological bases. Now, I am not saying Jesus was a myth, but I am saying that there was a historic Jesus, and then there is a mythological aspect to Jesus, and you can take some of those mythological aspects and compare those to other mythological figures from those time periods and well before that, but I don't think that necessarily means that those ideas were stolen from those other characters.
Faith is the opposite of logic and reason. No, it's not. Faith just means trust.
Really, you are conflating definitions of faith. Faith is complete trust or confidence in someone or something in the first sense, but in the second sense, it's strong belief in God or in the doctrines of a religion based on spiritual apprehension rather than proof. That's the literal definition of religious faith. It's very different than the generalized idea of faith, i.e., I have faith in other people. Very different idea, very different concept. But I gotta admit, that's a nice sleight of hand you did there, trying to conflate two different ideas of the same concept.
Anytime you eat food, you're having faith that it's not poisoned, even if you can't scientifically prove it. If you're married, you have faith that your wife loves you, even if you can't scientifically prove that. And if you tried to scientifically prove it, she'd probably get very mad at you because it would mean you didn't trust her.
Silly argument.
Evolution proves God didn't create the world.
I don't think anybody's making that argument. I think evolution does prove that the Genesis story of creation of Adam and Eve is wrong if it is to be taken literal, which I think a lot of people do take it very literal. It's wrong if that's the case.
Not necessarily. God often works through natural processes in the Bible.
But that's not what the Bible says about the creation of humanity, which is, again, a big problem unless you think that it's just a metaphor. And if you think it's a metaphor, well, why not everything else? Or almost everything else?
And for all of church history, there have been prominent Christian theologians who have had a more metaphorical interpretation of Genesis, even well over 1,000 years before Darwin existed.
But the question of whether it is supposed to be a metaphor or not is far from solved. More liberal Christians would say, yes, that is a metaphor, but more fundamentalist Christians, i.e., the vast majority of Protestants, would say that it is literal.
Christianity only spread because of military conquest. Well, eventually they did do military conquest, but for the first 300 years of Christianity, it was illegal.
Okay, that is false. Christianity was not illegal in the Roman Empire. For one thing, I know that's a very common misconception that Christians have. There were occasional crackdowns in different provinces by different governors because of Christianity's supposedly antisocial nature, but that is not the same as Christianity as a whole being illegal for 300 years. They could not have maintained a church in Rome and churches in several other places that were widely known if it had been illegal for the first 300 years. This is nonsense.
And it took over the Roman Empire despite that because of how popular it became.
I also must say that I don't think the reason Christianity became popular is because of conquest. Now, there are cases where Christians did use conquest to spread their beliefs, but I don't think that is the main driver of Christianity, personally.
Constantine invented what we now know of as Christianity.
Sort of. I will say sort of here. Not entirely. I'm not saying I completely agree with that. But he is largely responsible for the, at least, Catholic ideas of Christianity because he basically forced all the sects to come together and make agreements on the nature of God and that sort of thing to achieve unity. In the Roman Empire, oh God, this is going to be some nerdy stuff, but in the Roman Empire, religion and state were not separate. Religion was a justifier of state. So to make Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire, which didn't happen until much later, which is probably something Constantine would have done if he had the ability to, they needed some kind of unity. He tried to get the Christians united so that it would help make the empire stronger in the end. Now, Whether he actually succeeded is up for debate. These debates raged on long after Constantine, the same ones that he had tried to solve. But I think you cannot underrate the importance of Constantine in forming the modern idea of Christianity through his vast power and influence and that of his successors, some of which were his own children.
Again, Reddit atheist level myth. Atheists can do better than that. Listen to an actual scholar.
I would think that actually I would say probably the most accurate way to say it would be that Paul was the creator of Christianity on the whole, and Constantine played a very important role in the development of Christianity in the Roman Empire, which then spread it to the whole world. Now, that's not the same thing as saying Constantine invented Christianity. I think Paul has much more of a claim on that than Constantine does personally.
If Christianity is true, why are there so many denominations of it?
Well, the Bible does say God is not the author of confusion, and as Dan Barker points out, which book has caused more confusion than the Bible?
Well, yeah, there are a lot of denominations, but the things they agree on are a lot more significant than the things they disagree on.
No, not really. They don't agree on the essentials. Some essentials, sure, but not all of them. I think that this is kind of like overstating the case for unity here. These all disagree very heavily on any number of issues.
There's no evidence for Jesus outside the Bible.
Correct.
Well, that's not true. There's the ancient Jewish historian Josephus who wrote about Jesus, and he's one of the reasons why even secular scholars...
Josephus wrote about Christians and what they believed. He did not write about an actual Jesus. However, whether Josephus did or not is relevant because there was a historical Jesus. I think that is beyond dispute. Now, I don't think Josephus justifies it. In fact, at least one passage in Josephus was modified later on to kind of prove the Christian case. So not all of Josephus's writing on Christianity is attributable to him directly. But at the same time, again, I think that you don't need evidence for Jesus outside the Bible to say there was a historical Jesus. I think there was. I think scholarship has more or less proven that to a really good extent. But I don't think it matters a whole lot in the end, personally. But there isn't. As far as we're aware, there is not any contemporary evidence for Jesus outside of the Bible.
Scholars know Jesus historically existed. You really think God made billions of galaxies with billions of stars in each of them just to have a personal relationship with you?
That is a good point.
Yes.
Well, incredible argument, my guy. I don't buy it. But anyway, thanks for the fun times. That sure was something. You know, you could do better than this. I understand you're doing it like a speed run kind of thing, but like next time, maybe do a little bit better. It's not that we don't know these arguments exist. We just don't find them very convincing or compelling, and that is a problem. If you want to convince us that you are correct, you should actually go about convincing us that you are correct, not just by saying, well, we have answers to these arguments and listing the same answers we have heard over and over. That, again, we do not buy.